Good afternoon, students. In today's session, we are going to cover another important aspect of experimental research design, which is external validity. The extent to which the objective of the researcher is attained is a measure of the external validity of the experimental research design. So, to the extent to which the objective of the researcher is attained is a measure of the external validity of the experimental research design. This validity is concerned with the generalizability. Dredge and Glass 1968 have classified external validity into two types. It has been classified into two major types according to Dredge and Glass. First is population validity and second is ecological validity. So let's talk about population validity. Population validity is concerned with the identification of the population to which the result of an experiment can be generalized. For instance, in the example under discussion, the researcher has studied the effectiveness of remedial teaching or special teaching program in science subject on a sample of 10th grade students and found that a special program for teaching helps in gaining or improving scores of students. So from these results, the researcher would like to conclude that remedial teaching or special teaching program is helpful for the groups of 10th grade. In order to make valid generalizations from the experimental results to larger populations, the researcher must correctly identify populations to which the result can be generalized accurately. For this, the researcher has to make a distinction between the experimentally accessible population and our target population. The former refers to the population of subject that, that is within the reach of the researcher for his study, which we are going to include in our research work, which is experimentally accessible population and the target population. So the former, which is experimentally research population, accessible population. So this refers to the population of subject that is within the reach of the researcher for his study purpose. The latter is the total group of subjects to whom he wants to apply the conclusions from the result of his experiment. So all the 10th grade students studying in high school of a particular district where the experiment has been conducted may be the experimentally accessible population on which we conducted our research work. The target population would be all 10th grade students in that particular district or state. The generalizations of the study would be done in two phases. From the experimental sample of 10th grade students to the experimentally accessible population. 10th grade students of all secondary schools of the concerned district. From the accessible population to the target population. 10th grade students of all high school of the state. If the researcher follows the principle of randomization in selecting the experimental sample from the experimentally accessible population, 10th grade students in the high school of that district. We can generalize the findings to this population without any difficulty. For this, researcher has to specify the accessible population by listing and numbering its every member and then select the appropriate sample through the use of random numbers or random methods or any other random appropriate procedure. Generalizations from the accessible population to the target population are somewhat risky and cannot be made with the same degree of confidence as the former type. For such generalization, the researcher must have a thorough knowledge of the characteristics of the accessible population and target population. If the characteristics of both the populations are similar, the researcher can generalize the result because characteristics of accessible and target population are similar. That's why findings can be generalized. Result can be generalized more confidently. But if the researcher has randomly selected his experimental sample from all 10th grade students of a particular district, then the accessible population would be more like the target population, all 10th grade students of that state. And the findings could be generalized to the target population with much more confidence. When the researcher attempts to generalize from the accessible population to the target population, it is important for him to know that one is similar to the other with respect to certain significant and relevant characteristics. The interaction as the result of selection by treatment also contributes to the population validity. When a researcher selects two experimentally accessible population and these are not representative of the same target population, the similar studies on two accessible populations can lead to entirely different results. In other words, or in simple words, an interaction that may occur between the treatment and the characteristics of one more experimental sample selected from accessible population would not occur in another experimental sample selected from the second accessible population with different characteristics. So, therefore, it would not be possible for the researcher to generalize the findings from one sample to another. Second is ecological validity. In addition to population validity, the researcher should also be concerned with ecological validity. It is concerned with generalizing experimental effects to the environmental conditions. To have ecological validity, a design must provide assurance that the experimental effect is dependent of the particular experimental environment. According to Paul, the researcher must give increased attention to some factors for achieving ecological validity, which we are going to discuss. First is researcher must furnish a complete description of the operations and the experimental setting involved in the experimental study. It helps a reader to judge to what extent the results can be generalized to other situations. In the same example, the researcher has studied the effectiveness of teaching program in science subject on 10th grade students under certain experimental conditions. The findings would not be applicable to other subject areas of the same grade. Remember, these findings will not be applicable to other subject areas of the same grade. It is applicable only for science subjects, not for mathematics, not for computer, only for science, unless the study is extended to a variety of teaching situations. At the same time, the researcher must give due consideration to the experimental arrangements while generalizing findings of the study. There may be a reactive effect due to the experimental procedure. The presence of observers, experimental equipment, and knowledge of participation of the subjects in an experiment make the subjects aware of the fact that they are receiving experimental treatments, and therefore they may change their normal behavior. Such a change is called Hawthorne effect. If subjects change the behavior that is being measured, the researcher cannot claim that the effect of treatment variable for the same population will be the same for subjects who are exposed to treatment variable in non-experimental situations. Another concern in ecological validity is the question of representativeness of the independent or experimental variables and dependent or criterion variables. Variable representativeness influence the generalizability of the findings of an experimental study. For example, when a researcher speaks of special teaching program or remedial teaching, they need to clarify what kind of special teaching program or remedial activity they mean. Because research is about accuracy. We cannot things we cannot claim things or talk about things which are vague. So they should be specified clearly and it should have accuracy as well. Certain interaction effects may influence the generalizability of experimental findings. When two or more treatments are administered to the same group within the same or different studies, it is difficult to find the cause of the experimental results or to generalize the result to the experimental setting in which only one treatment is present. In some situations, a pretest may increase or decrease the sensitivity or responsiveness of experimental subjects to the independent or experimental variable, and therefore findings obtained for this pretest population cannot be generalized for the unpretested population from which the experimental subjects were selected. The tool or instrument used for the measurement of dependent variable also contribute to the ecological validity. For instance, if a researcher uses an essay type test to measure academic achievement, what is academic achievement? It is dependent variable. We can say that the same effect would be observed if an objective type test would be used as the measure of the dependent variable. So, in short, we can conclude it as that experimental design is blueprint of the experimentation in educational research. It is our blueprint, how we are going to proceed. The validity of the experimental design depends upon the achievement of major objectives of the experiment. So the researcher must select a design that is strong both in internal and external validity. However, in certain educational experiments, one type of validity can be obtained at the cost of another. In such cases, the researcher should attempt to reach a balance between two types of validity. That is, he should choose a design within particular limits, within practical limits that provides sufficient control to make results interpretable and generalize findings to the intended settings. In our next session, we will talk about controls in experimental design.